Chapter 3: The Uncrowned King of Nine Knives. Few adult citizens of Nine Knives County, Michigan, were unfamiliar with the name Snap Brollins. The toddler-born Williard Lymph Brollins earned his nickname when he climbed his mother's dressing gown nearly 6 feet skyward on a crisp spring morning in 1950, only to have the decade-old line give out and send him hurtling to the ground. Most on Crescent Avenue and adjoining streets recall hearing a quite literal snap. 38 years later, when Brollins was composing his autobiography with a ghostwriter, he commissioned a materials scientist from Purdue University to research this and explain the physical phenomenon that had occurred. At approximately 600 psi tensile strength, 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and 65% relative humidity, a weathered nylon polyester clothesline stretched near its elastic limit bore an approximate load of 43 pounds per square inch, distributed over 2½ inches of line. The dynamic motion of the load compounded the strain, and the release of stored elastic potential energy created an acoustic shock effect, producing a sharp mid-frequency crack measuring 86 decibels. Much like the lion hide episode from the life of Hercules, Snap felt it was a necessary and telling inclusion to explain his lifelong mercantile prowess. Excluded from the book were the anecdotes from family and neighbors prior to the incident describing a kindly and gently curious child. Also omitted were their lamentations over the later, evil lizard of a child that emerged, petulant, unpleasant, and never pleased. His parents, Eugene and Wayla, refused to spoil their child, though, and were remarkably unfazed by the behavioral changes. Some viewed the digging of a pit in their backyard and Titus-like habit of placing young Williard in the 8-foot steep containment to battle African civets, usually 2 or 3 at a time. While this was a punishment at first, when the boy began to increasingly hop in the pit for rounds on his own to let off steam, it became clear that any intended negative effect had waned. After his father's death in June 1968, rarely was a strip mall or parking deck or public park built, or a city block zoned without Snap's hand on the transaction. In May 1970, he shocked the UP business real estate community by buying out the Helvig brothers, a Norwegian firm most well known for the Odin Memorial Stadium in Oslo. By the summer of 2012, every drop of Nine Knives County, over 1,214 square miles, had been purchased, brokered, or was in the hands of a Brollins ally. The 1990s crusade of State Senator Pete Evade, who had spearheaded the snapback campaign in opposition to his local oligarchy, left Brollins largely unscathed. Now he increasingly eyed slightly larger Penetration County with its eponymous county seat. On the morning of December 11th, he awoke in his palatial bedroom, looking out over the hazy mist of Lower Lake Echinacea, to find his wife Jeanette standing with arms on her hips, dressed in a casual velour jumpsuit and fuzzy slippers. "Good morning, murderer," she half spat in her syrupy Dothan, Alabama accent. Most of any age or gender would potentially be alarmed by such an accusation, but it had become a standard facet of Snap's bombastic dialogue with his wife of 30 years. He struggled a bit against his girth, rolling the comforter and sheet downward to free his hairy, yet slightly shiny shoulders and arms, framed in a white tank top. "Who did I sin against today?" His response rose warily, barely outrunning him as he swung his bowed legs out from underneath the covers. "You know exactly what you did." She began to pace, repeatedly drawing the letter C on the lush seafoam carpet under her slippers. "You ignored me, and now Harper is dead. He's dead." Snap sat with the comfort of a selfish and long-married man, his wide gut reaching out to rest on his thighs right where they met his plaid boxers, $15 a pair at Menards. He was old. Old dogs die. Grunting, he started to rise, but saw her swing around directly in front of him, blocking his ascent. He lurched as if suppressing a chuckle and glanced at the digital embossed numbers on the ivory Emerson alarm clock. It read 8:04 a.m. This level of confrontation was unusual before 2 in the afternoon. "All I asked was for you to put some lamb and rice in the bowl on the one day I was away so Harper could have a bite to eat, and you couldn't even manage that." The remnants of a pink feather boa floated off her jumpsuit as she berated him. Snap ruminated on the fact that they did not own and had never owned such an accessory. Words began to formulate in his mind that he absolutely intended to say. These included the phrases, "I didn't buy him," and he was already circling the drain when she preempted him. "I hope he haunts you, Snap. I hope you feel the shiver of him brushing on your leg when he isn't there. You won't ever sleep good again, not after this. Just lay there in your bed, Mr. Realtor of the year 1990, because he's coming for you, with flames shooting out at ya." Just as he took in a breath to respond to this volley, she ripped open the door to the hallway and started out, turning to look down. On him with the widest version of her mascard eyes, seeming a foot taller than normal. "He's coming for you." Brollins shook his head, swung his legs back onto the bed, laid back and exhaled in frustration towards the high popcorn ceiling. Drivers, assistants, and business partners as handy as Percy Helm did not come along often, and Snap often had to ask all three roles from his friend from Saginaw. Loretta Bancroft, the VP of Finance for Brollins and Family Realty, normally took turns at the wheel of the Buick Roadmaster and had a habit of barrel rolling through empty warehouse parking lots as she liked scaring the boys. This morning she was down in Muskegon shooting trap, so it was left to he and Percy to meet with poultry baron and investor Antonio de la Vega and his sisters to survey downtown Penetration, Michigan. It was the day that Snap had marked down months ago, the first act of his conquest of the whole sister county. Clad in a camel-toned Hart Schaffner Mark single, breasted with wide lapels, high-waisted double-pleated trousers, he straightened the subtle paisley tie, cinching it under the pointed collar of his light cream cotton broadcloth arrow. At 11 a.m., he slid one then both of his Allen Edmonds cordovan lace-ups into the passenger seat next to Percy, and they were off. Helm always talked. Rattled even, a gale of endless figures and percentages that seemed to encircle him like flies. Snap didn't listen all that much to begin with, but stared out the rushing pine and roadside as they made their way down Hiawatha Parkway towards the highway. He often looked at each parcel and saw its file folder in his head. Who owned it if he didn't own it? Who sold it? Or if still wanted it? When they passed the familiar orphaned concrete drive to the old Armature residence, he saw a boy that looked much like him in his youth. Angry too, just as he would have been. Next to the boy there was a dog that looked a fair amount like the one he'd just been accused of murdering. It was a boxer though, close but not a Staffordshire Terrier. He muttered the words, "Nice try," to himself. Percy, who actually did listen to everything Snap said, immediately ceased Operation Verbal Hail and made an inquiry. What was that? He waved off his driver's question without bothering to explain, and Helm returned to the 2011 adjusted percentages of Bay County light industrial plots owned by out-of-state interests. Minutes later on Cedar Parkway, when Helm was discussing the subset of lots prone to flooding, Snap peered with a look of inconceivability at the back window of a Subaru driving in. Front of them. There had to be 10 or 12 mixed-breed dogs in the car. For reasons he couldn't explain, this made him queasy, which had an observer been sitting on the hood of the car staring at Snap, would have been very obvious. "Who does that?" he sneered to Percy. "How can they drive like that?" By the time Helm uttered his typical, "What was that?" the offending car and its circus of inhabitants had turned left at the Penetration Regional Library and were out of the field of view. "I don't see 'em, Snap," Percy offered while looking through the windshield at different angles, all equally useless. It all just irritated Brollins, and he stewed, even more than usual. He didn't even want to look at the parcels on the roadside. It was a rare feeling of unease. Antonio de la Vega and his two sisters, Carolina and Rosalba, stood on the sidewalk in front of Buckthorn Grill on Penetration Avenue, well posed for a photograph should one have been taken. Percy rolled into a free handicap spot. His ambitious passenger looked in a quick swipe around the busy midday bustle. "I'm going to own every piece of this." As it usually did, the hand of Snap Brollins seemed to rise out of the passenger car door, with his buttoned-up lion seal body following. He had a habit of disembarking into handshakes as if wire-guided, worming out of the vehicle with his hand looking for another hand, like a cruise missile. This frequently sent the other greeting party into a backward scramble or worse, with the ill-conceived leverage at play. Rosalba de la Vega, the older sister, dropped nearly to the ground trying to catch the handshake this time. As Antonio, all smiles, and the youngest de la Vega helped her up, Snap ran his thumbs and fingers around his belt in a grooming motion as he backed up, feeling very warrior-like. On this day, however, he misjudged the sidewalk's edge and went himself careening backwards, ploughing the back of his horseshoe-styled auburn hair into the grimy teeth of a metal post, holding aloft a penetration point of historical interest sign. Christ. Rollins reached instinctively back to feel for blood, but there was none, despite the searing pain. A passerby looked behind him as he passed Snap, presumably looking for the person named Christ that the lion seal on the ground was calling out to. Percy and Antonio helped Snap to his feet, and the three of them collectively and accidentally found themselves looking in the direction of the Edward Gilt Studios as they dusted off their fallen leader. Inside the Gilt, at that precise moment, Colonel Stephen Prather stood in his recording booth holding a very oversized replica animal head in his hands. "Terry, does it plug in?" "I don't see a plug," he opined. "Batteries in the head." Terry's voice came back. "Good deal." Prather placed the oversized head over his own. Across the busy street, Antonio and his sisters had now unfolded a commercial property survey of downtown penetration, a portion of which Percy now traced a finger down, like an archaeologist. Snap made one last meticulous adjustment to his brown Western Heritage belt, lingering just long enough for his eye to focus across 4 lanes of traffic, a small courtyard, a double-door entryway, across a few more interceding panes of glass, all the way to the booth where the colonel stood. But he didn't see the colonel. What he saw, as clear as anything he had ever set eyes on, was a human body with the head of a Staffordshire Terrier. Harper. The word burned into a spot behind his eyes. He quickly turned to earn the attention of his business colleagues. Inside the studio booth, Prather was impatient and muffled. "Terry, is it voice-activated?" When he turned to look in the direction he perceived to be Terry, the 11 AA batteries in the dog head rained onto the threadbare carpet below him. As the colonel dropped to the floor to reload the power cells, Terry patiently explained that once he reloaded the battery, he needed only bark to activate the eyes once he had them resecured. Right through there, Snap jabbed his fingers exasperatedly at the studios across Penetration Avenue. The others looked in lockstep in precisely the direction suggested, but saw little except the manic black curls on Terry's head at the control desk on the right-hand side of the building. Antonio de la Vega, his sisters Carolina and Rosalba, and Percy Helm offered sympathetic explanations that ranged from humidity to exhaust fumes. When they felt they had offered him adequate social support, they returned to the map, which they all 4 worked to spread out to its full wingspan. "Easy, buddy," Prather told himself, rising slowly from behind the recording booth table, precisely guiding his movement so as not to send the 11 AAs out the bomber doors again. Terry gave him a thumbs up upon seeing the head of the Staffordshire Terrier break line of vision again. "Just bark, Colonel. That will activate the internal mini-monitors and the exterior high-density guide lights." Snap Bollins would watch as exactly that unfolded, when the man with the head of a Staffordshire Terrier slowly menacingly rose up in the spot where he had appeared moments before, and when the colonel barked, he did see inside the oversized, unventilated head 2 dim screens light up, offering a black-and-white view of the studio interior and the grainy street beyond. Snap, on the other hand, would see the dense clusters of red LED running lights with lasers at the centers of each, burning like ethereal coals in the place of the eyes of this peculiar species that only he could see. It could only be Harper, come after him. In broad daylight, where everyone stood around him, but no one could see. When the ruby red of the Staffordshire Terrier's right eye laser landed on his lapel, a violent fit of wheezing overtook Snap, and he pushed down to rest on his right knee. Percy Helm briefly dropped to his right knee as well, believing this might be a rite of passage that had not been revealed to him in the 30 years and 4 months they had worked together. Additional pedestrians eventually consulted with Helm and convinced him that there may be a medical situation. When a pair of muscular medics arrived 10 minutes later to begin work on Snap, Antonio de la Vega, his sisters Carolina and Rosalba had long since slunk back into the building crowd and made their way back to parts undisclosed. Percy stood over his friend, spread out on the concrete, his tan suit filleted around his spasming body, certain only that this had to be a low-percentage event. "That thing is an oven, but I love the feel of the fur here." The colonel sat the terrier head on the recording booth desk and stared into its eyes. The eyes have got something too, his mussed hair felted with sweat dripping down on the collar of his crisp white shirt. A flash of red and white lights popped into his eyes, and he looked up to see an ambulance driving away from a commotion in front of the Buckthorn Grill. "Terry, be sure to email Pitney and thank him for the dog head. Tell him I'll need some time to figure out what I can use it for." He saw Terry nod outside and crack open a laptop. Prather's gaze drifted to the cluttered corner of the room where an unopened crate bearing the stamp Pitney Hauler LLC sat next to a tent of microphone stands and boom arms. His eyes dropped to the promotional copy on his desk and the cover page featuring the glossy but slightly color-separated faces of the post-punk band, Holt Invaders. They stared back at him, their expressions an odd mixture of defiance and desperation. On April 9, 1977, at the Los Angeles Airport Marriott, he'd been introduced to their lead singer, Pitney Hauler. They were both there for the '77 science fiction, horror, and fantasy world exposition, and spent most of the event circulating between booths, offering corrections to the various merchants on their signage and press information. That chance meeting evolved in time into an enduring, if eccentric, friendship. Prather leaned back in his chair, the creak of the springs performing vocal exercises. His mind drifted to their most recent meeting, only weeks earlier, that had first brought the Elastic Angel battleware briefs to his attention. It had been at a dingy storage room in the back of a Spot Johnny's, a gas station cum bait cum ammunition shop, just outside Eckerman in the Upper Peninsula, the last one in Michigan, much to the colonel's chagrin. Pitney, flanked by two dubious-looking associates clad in matching bolo ties, had outlined his vision with the fervor of a man on the brink of discovery. "This isn't just underwear, Steve," Pitney had declared, slapping a hand on the prototype briefs laid out on the folding table. "This is armor. This is salvation." Now, seated in the dim studio, Prather nodded at the memory and adjusted the microphone. The red recording light blinked to life, and he leaned forward, his voice rich with conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we stand on the brink of a new era, an era of unbridled abundance, where Earth itself is overflowing with life from every nook and cranny. Everywhere we look, verdant fields burst with oversized crops, and wildflowers sprawl uncontrollably across the landscape. This may sound like paradise," he continued, his tone darkening, "until you find yourself taking a leisurely stroll through a field of mega wheat, the 10-foot-tall variety famously kept under wraps by our very own Department of Agriculture. One trip, one slip, and suddenly you're buried under a dense tidal wave of grain. You try to rise, only to realize the stalks are actively cocooning you." The bare clink of a coffee mug from the control booth caught his ear, but Prather didn't falter. He allowed a brief pause, letting the gravity of his words settle before adding, "This might be less horrifying if it didn't happen to Pitney Hauler, friend of the show and lead singer of the post-punk band Holt Invaders." Each passage brought him back to the Spot Johnnies. "No, leave that in," one of the bolo-tied men had said, pointing from 4 feet away at a paragraph in front of the colonel at the time. Neither of the men sat during the hour discussion. "My friend, I can tell you the ridgeline created by these briefs was so flattering, the Domino's guy mistook me for a chick." Pitney had grunted with an impressed air. "That's the magic of science," the second bolo tie had said. Pitney had narrowed his eyes confidently at the colonel when their glances met. It was in the same continuum as January 1979, when the singer agreed to accept ad spots for years in exchange for the $700 loan that kept beyond the near horizon on the air. Back in the booth, Prather turned to the next page of copy. "Folks, these come in a variety of colors and are estimated to take 11 million years to biodegrade. You can buy a 3-pack for €84, but here's the deal. The only way to purchase Elastic Angel battleware briefs from Pitney Hauler LLC is by downloading the Holt Invaders app from the Windows Phone 8 store." Prather tapped on his Windows Phone's display to awaken it. The screen remained dark. "If you're like me, everyone you work and live with has a Windows Phone." Pop over to the phone store, download the app, and change your life. Back in that parking lot in Eckerman, when they had parted ways, Pitney had seemed hurried as he waved, oddly elated with their agreement. The left rear door of Hauler's PT Cruiser had opened and shut rapidly by design as the musician disappeared with a thud, just as the car started. The Sunfire yellow pearl coat had faded into an unidentifiable hue in the 12 or so years since its assembly. Elastic Angel battleware briefs, Prather concluded, the only thing standing between you and a vengeance-obsessed Mother Earth. Through the glass, Terry gave a thumbs up. Outside, the clouds thickened, their shadows deepening as they swept across the low-slung building. Prather tapped his pen against the desk and returned to Eckerman, flinching slightly with the retreating yelps of the poorly aligned wheels scampering back onto Michigan 28. He'd stood on the uneven, patchy asphalt, fixated on the stuffed contents of the PT Cruiser's interior, visible only in a flash. But he had seen it. A flicker of movement that climbed, serpent-like, over the heap of clutter, its form indistinct, but undeniably alive. The image lingered, burned into his mind even with the trio gone. Terry was no longer in the booth, and the studio was empty. Prather took out a writing pad to focus his recollection, but made no notes. Maybe it was a small, perhaps infant Tariaksuk from the Inuit, son or daughter of some family of shadow people. He stared at the pen as he held it upward. He couldn't rule out the shifty, dangerous Erebes. As a pursuer of the occult, he wrought magnetism for them, whether he wished to or not. He set the pen down. T-3 days to Port Manzanillo, and by the end of the voyage, maybe an answer, maybe another question.